For months he pretended not to see her, until that night all eyes turned to her. Faced with public humiliation, the millionaire felt something he hadn't known in a long time, jealousy burning like fire in his chest. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel. We post daily. Continuing. The dazzling sparkle of crystal glasses reflected the luxury of the Grand Brighton Hotel that gala night. Helen took a deep breath, trying to control her nervousness as she adjusted the black dress that elegantly hugged her curves. Another night, another event. A few more. Hours pretending that her marriage to Richard Maxwell was perfect. The man everyone envied, a successful businessman, heir to Maxwell Developments, with a real estate empire stretching from London to the north of England, was just a shadow in her own home. 6 years of marriage had transformed youthful love into an empty relationship. Helen watched her husband from across the ballroom, surrounded by businessmen and politicians, displaying that rehearsed smile she knew so well. Richard hadn't even noticed her presence since they arrived, as usual. "Champagne, madam?" a waiter offered. Helen accepted the glass with a polite smile. At 32, she was considered one of the most envied women in London's high society. Few knew that behind the image of the perfect wife of the real estate magnate, there was a woman suffocated by loneliness. "You look stunning tonight." The deep voice surprised her. Helen turned and met the intense eyes of a man she had never seen before. "Daniel Evans," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Photographer. I'm covering the event for the magazine." There was something different in his gaze. It wasn't the superficial admiration she was used to, but a genuine interest, as if he could see beyond the facade. "Helen Maxwell," she replied, feeling an unexpected warmth in her cheeks. "I know who you are," Daniel smiled. A sincere smile, without pretenses. "In fact, I was waiting for the right moment to photograph you. There's a melancholy in your eyes that contrasts perfectly with all this ostentation." The observation caught her off guard. Helen was so used to being treated as an accessory that she had forgotten what it was like to be truly seen. "Melancholy? I think you're confusing my boredom with something deeper," she retorted, trying to maintain her composure. Daniel smiled again. "Perhaps. But I'm trained to see what people try to hide." Across the ballroom, Richard finally noticed his wife's interaction with the stranger. For a brief moment, his impassive expression changed. Helen noticed, but for the first time in years, she didn't care. The conversation with Daniel flowed naturally. He wasn't from her world. Raised on the outskirts of Liverpool, he had gained international recognition for his photographs depicting social contrasts. His brown eyes sparkled when he spoke about his work, about the real people he photographed, about life beyond the walls of mansions and the pages of luxury magazines. "How did you end up here then?" Helen asked, genuinely curious. "Sometimes I need to photograph the other side to tell the complete story," he replied, with a look that seemed to unravel every layer of protection she had built over the years. The night advanced, and Helen realized she hadn't felt so alive in a long time. When Daniel asked for her contact to send the photos he had taken of her, she hesitated for only a second before giving him her personal email. An email Richard didn't even know existed. Upon arriving home, an imposing penthouse overlooking the English Channel in Brighton, Richard broke the usual silence. Who was that man? The question sounded casual, but Helen knew the controlled tone he used when something bothered him. "A photographer. He was covering the event," she replied with the same casualness. "You seemed quite intimate." "We were just talking, Richard. Something you and I rarely do lately." The comment hung in the air between them like a silent accusation. Richard adjusted the expensive watch on his wrist, a gesture he made when he felt uncomfortable. "I've been working hard to maintain all this," he said, gesturing to the luxury that surrounded them. "I thought you appreciated the lifestyle I built for us." Helen felt the familiar frustration grow within her. "For you, Richard. You built it for yourself. I never wanted half of it." "That's not what it seemed like when we met," he retorted coldly. The comment hit Helen like a slap. She remembered perfectly how they had met 8 years ago, when she worked as a receptionist at a hotel in a charming coastal town in Cornwall. Richard was staying for a business conference, The rising young businessman's charm had captivated her, and she had let herself be carried away by the intense romance. At the time, she believed she had found the love of her life, but now she understood that what Richard loved was the idea of her, young, dazzled, moldable. "You don't even know me anymore, Richard," she finally said, turning to the guest room where she had slept for almost a year. The next morning, an email from Daniel awaited in her inbox. There weren't just the promised photos, but an invitation. He was organizing an exhibition in a gallery in Bristol's historic district and would like her to attend. Helen hesitated. She knew she would cross a line if she accepted, but when she looked at the photographs Daniel had sent, something awakened within her. In the images, she wasn't Richard Maxwell's trophy wife. She was just Helen, with all her complexity, vulnerability, and dormant strength. In the following weeks, Helen's life gained colors that had long disappeared. She started going out alone, visiting museums and cafes she had always wanted to see. She enrolled in a photography course, something she had always wanted to do, but which Richard considered a pointless hobby. With each step, she took away from her husband's shadow. She rediscovered parts of herself that had been silenced. Daniel became a constant presence, first through emails, then in casual meetings around the city. He encouraged her, challenged her perspectives, made her laugh. There was a connection between them that went beyond physical attraction. It was a mutual recognition of souls dissatisfied with the limitations imposed by their circumstances. Richard, absorbed in his negotiations and travels, barely noticed the changes in his wife. When he was home, which became increasingly rare, he remained distant, as if they inhabited parallel worlds within the same luxurious apartment. It was Amanda, her sister-in-law, who first noticed the transformation. "You're different," she commented during lunch. "More alive." Helen tried to disguise it. "It's your imagination." "No, it's not," Amanda insisted, studying her carefully. "Is there someone? Is that it?" "It's not what you're thinking," Helen replied, feeling her heart race. "I just rediscovered some old passions." "Like photography?" Amanda asked, raising an eyebrow. "Richard told me about the course." "Exactly," Helen confirmed, surprised that her husband had noticed. Amanda sighed. "He's worried, you know. He thinks you're drifting away." "Impossible to drift away from someone who was never present," Helen replied, more bitterly than she intended. On the way home, Amanda's words echoed in her mind. Was she really betraying Richard? Not physically, but emotionally? The connection she felt with Daniel was undeniable, but Helen resisted labeling what was between them. It was friendship, admiration, perhaps the beginning of something deeper. What she knew for sure was that, for the first time in years, she felt alive. The opportunity to confront her feelings came sooner than expected. Richard announced a business dinner at their home that night, an important meeting with international investors interested in a new venture. Helen, as always, was expected to play the role of the perfect hostess. "Wear the blue dress," Richard instructed as he adjusted his tie in front of the mirror. "The one I bought in Milan." Helen felt a wave of irritation. "I prefer the red one." Richard stopped and stared at her, surprised by the unusual resistance. "The blue one matches the ambiance better." "The red one matches me better," she retorted, holding his gaze. A tense silence settled between them. Helen could see the confusion in her husband's eyes, as if he was trying to recognize the woman in front of him. "As you wish," he finally conceded, turning his attention back to the mirror. Guests began to arrive at 8, executives in expensive suits, accompanied by equally adorned wives. Helen greeted them with polite smiles, serving drinks and facilitating conversations. The social ritual she knew so well. It was when the last guest arrived that her world stopped. Daniel, impeccable in a simple suit, entered the room alongside Robert Finch, one of Richard's main investors. "Helen, this is Daniel Evans," Robert introduced, oblivious to the tension that instantly settled. "A brilliant photographer I hired to document some social projects for my foundation." "We've already met," Helen replied, trying to keep her voice steady as she felt Richard's gaze burning on the back of her neck. Dinner proceeded in a suffocating atmosphere. Helen felt the weight of Daniel's eyes following her every move, while she tried to ignore Richard's silent scrutiny. Conversation flowed around her, business, politics, economics, but her mind was elsewhere. "So, Daniel, how do you know my wife?" Richard's question cut through the conversation like a sharp blade. Daniel maintained his composure. "At the Grand Brighton Hotel Gala. I was lucky enough to photograph her." "Lucky indeed," Richard replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Helen rarely allows herself to be photographed." "Perhaps it's a matter of trusting the photographer's eye," Daniel observed, holding Richard's gaze. Helen felt the air thicken. The other guests, sensing the tension, quickly changed the subject, but the damage was done. For the first time, she saw something new in Richard's eyes, not just irritation or control, but jealousy. Real, visceral, uncontrollable jealousy. After the guests departed, the silence in the penthouse was deafening. Helen collected empty glasses, avoiding the inevitable confrontation. "How long?" Richard's voice sounded more tired than irritated. "How long what? Don't play dumb with me, Helen. How long have you and this photographer?" Helen set down the glass she was holding and faced her husband. "There is no me and this photographer, Richard. But yes, we've seen each other a few times for conversations, something you and I haven't had in years." Richard ran a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of vulnerability. "What happened to us?" The question caught her off guard. There was so much sincerity in those words that for a moment Helen glimpsed the man she had fallen in love with. "You stopped seeing me," she finally replied, "and I, little by little, ceased to exist." "That's not true," he protested, approaching her. "Everything I did, every achievement, every deal was for us." "No, Richard. It was for you. For your need to prove something to your father, to the world. I never wanted the diamonds or the trips. I just wanted the man I fell in love with in Cornwall." Richard closed his eyes, as if the words physically struck him. "I can still be that man." Helen felt tears forming. "I don't know if I believe that, or if it even matters anymore." Helen's cell phone vibrated on the table. A message from Daniel. "We need to talk. It's important." Richard saw the name on the screen, and his expression instantly changed. Vulnerability gave way to his usual coldness. "Go," he said, stepping away, "if that's what you want." Helen felt her heart clench. Was this it? Years of marriage reduced to a bitter farewell? "It's not that simple, Richard." "It never is," he replied, pouring himself a whiskey, "but perhaps it's necessary for both of us." That night, Helen didn't sleep. Richard's words, Daniel's message, her own confusion, everything spun in her mind like an uncontrolled carousel. In the morning, she made a decision. She needed space, clarity. She packed a small bag and left a note. "I need to find my way. Don't look for me." The apartment Daniel had found for her was in Notting Hill, a bohemian quarter far from the luxury of Brighton. It was simple, cozy, with a stunning view over the Bristol Channel. Helen felt a strange peace upon entering the space, as if she could finally breathe. Daniel appeared late in the afternoon, visibly concerned. "Are you okay? Does Richard know you're here?" "I'm fine, and no, he doesn't know, nor should he." Daniel nodded, respecting her decision. "There's something I need to tell you about your husband." Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. "What about him?" "The new venture they're planning, the resort on the Isle of Wight. The lands belong to a traditional fishing community, families who have been there for generations. Richard is using questionable methods to force them to sell." The information hit Helen like a punch. Richard had always been ruthless in business, but this? "How do you know this?" "I'm documenting the struggle of these families for Robert's foundation. What he doesn't know is that Richard is behind the threats." Helen felt the ground collapse. The man she knew, however distant he had become, wouldn't be capable of such cruelty. Or would he? "I need to see for myself," she decided. The next day, she accompanied Daniel to the Isle of Wight. The small fishing village was a stark contrast to the luxury she was accustomed to. Simple houses, colorful boats, people who had made their living from the sea for generations. Helen felt immediately connected to that place, to those people. Mrs. Juniper, an elderly woman with deep eyes and hands marked by work, told how men from the city had appeared, offering money for their lands, how the offers turned into veiled threats when they refused. "They say a certain Maxwell wants to build a paradise for the rich here," the old woman explained, "but this is already our paradise." Helen felt shame. Shame for the surname she carried, shame for the wealth built on the suffering of others, shame for her own blindness. That night, staying in a simple guest house in the village, Helen made another decision. She couldn't stand by while Richard destroyed lives in the name of profit. She would use her access, her knowledge, her name to stop him. The plan began to take shape when she called Amanda. "I need your help," she told her sister-in-law, "and we need to be discreet." Amanda, who had always maintained a distant relationship with her brother, didn't hesitate. "Whatever you need." In the days that followed, Helen immersed herself in an investigation into Maxwell Development's practices. With Amanda's help, who worked in the company's legal department, she discovered a disturbing pattern of controversial acquisitions, bribes to environmental inspectors, fraudulent documentation. Daniel, with his press connections, helped gather evidence. With each discovery, Helen felt her heart break a little more. The empire Richard had built, which she had so admired, was stained with blood and tears. "He'll destroy you when he finds out," Amanda warned during a secret meeting. Helen knew the risk. Richard was not a man to forgive betrayals, especially one of this caliber. But she no longer cared. She had found a purpose greater than her failed marriage, greater than her own safety. Her closeness with Daniel grew daily, not just through the work they did together, but through the worldview they shared. There was a harmony between them that Helen had never experienced with Richard. Still, she resisted moving forward with what was clearly turning into a deeper feeling. She needed to resolve her past before embracing any future. The opportunity arose when Richard announced a major launch event for the Isle of Wight Paradise Resort. Politicians, celebrities, press, everyone would be there to celebrate Maxwell Development's new sustainable and socially responsible venture. Helen knew it would be her only chance. With Daniel and Amanda's help, she meticulously planned every detail. What she didn't expect was Richard's call on the eve of the event. "I miss you," he said, his voice choked. "I came home and you were gone. I didn't try to find you because you asked me not to. But tomorrow is important for me, for us." Helen closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tightening in her chest. "Richard, don't say anything now. Just be there tomorrow. Please. We can start over, Helen. I've changed, or I'm trying to change." After hanging up, Helen felt tears stream down her face. For a brief moment, she questioned her decision. What if Richard was truly remorseful? What if they could really rebuild what they had? Daniel found her on the balcony, looking out at the sea. "Is everything okay?" Helen wiped her tears. "Richard called. He wants me to go to the launch tomorrow." Daniel nodded, understanding. "What do you want to do?" "What's right," she replied firmly. "I can't go back now." That night, alone in her room, Helen faced her demons. The love she had felt for Richard, the resentment that had grown over the years, the new feeling Daniel awakened, everything mingled in her chest like a violent storm. But when the sun rose, her resolve was unshaken. She dressed carefully, a red dress, the same shade she had worn the night Richard first showed jealousy. A symbol of the power she now recognized within herself. The event was to take place on a luxurious yacht anchored in the Isle of Wight Bay. Upon arrival, Helen felt all eyes on her. Surprise, curiosity, gossip. Ignoring the whispers, she walked with determination until she found Richard, imposing in his navy blue suit surrounded by admirers. Their eyes met, across the crowd. For a brief moment, Helen glimpsed genuine joy on her husband's face. He excused himself from the group and came to meet her. "You came," he said, kissing her on the cheek. A public, calculated gesture, but one that carried a tremor of real emotion. "I promised I'd be here," she replied, maintaining her composure. Richard led her across the deck, introducing her to important people, keeping his hand firmly on her waist. To all appearances, They were the perfect couple again. Helen played her part impeccably, smiling, conversing, charming. When the moment for the official presentation arrived, Richard surprised her. "I would like my wife to join me on stage. This project is as much hers as it is mine." Helen felt her stomach drop. It wasn't in the plans, but she adapted quickly, following him to the small stage set up on the yacht's bow. Richard spoke eloquently about sustainability, social responsibility, legacy. He spoke about transforming the Isle of Wight into a luxury destination while preserving its essence. Well-constructed lies, wrapped in sophisticated rhetoric. "And now I'd like to hand the microphone to the person who inspires me to be better every day. My wife Helen." The microphone passed into her hands. The audience waited, expectant. Helen felt the weight of all the decisions that had brought her there. She looked at Richard's face, at the elegant guests, at the sea beyond the yacht, where small fishing boats gathered in silent protest. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice clear and firm. "This is truly a significant moment." Richard smiled, proud beside her. "Significant, because today I have the opportunity to speak the truth." An absolute silence fell over the yacht. Richard's smile froze on his face while his eyes darkened with confusion. Helen felt a tremor run through her body, but she stood firm. There was no turning back. "The truth about Isle of Wight Paradise is that it will be built on the suffering of families who have lived on that land for generations," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Fishermen who are being threatened, coerced, and deceived into giving up their homes for paltry prices." Murmurs ran through the audience. Richard tried to reach for the microphone, but Helen pulled away. "The truth is that documents were falsified, environmental licenses bought, politicians bribed." She took an envelope from her bag and held it up. "I have all the proof here. Copies have already been sent to the Crown Prosecution Service and various media outlets." Richard's face transformed into a mask of fury. "Enough, Helen," he hissed through clenched teeth. "You don't know what you're doing." "For the first time in years, I know exactly what I'm doing," she retorted, staring at him fearlessly. Then she turned to the astonished audience. "In fact, I invited some of the true owners of those lands to be here today." As if responding to a signal, Mrs. Juniper and other villagers came aboard, escorted by Daniel, who was discreetly filming everything. The contrast between their simple clothes and the socialites' gala dresses was striking. "These are the faces behind the documents you never read, the lives being destroyed so you can have another exclusive resort to spend your weekend." Richard finally managed to snatch the microphone. "My guests, I apologize for this unfortunate spectacle. My wife is clearly not well. She has been facing personal problems that led her to believe lies told by people with ulterior motives." His murderous gaze fixed on Daniel, who continued filming. Impassively. "I suggest we continue our celebration while I handle this family matter," Richard concluded with a forced smile. But the damage was already done. Journalists present at the event were already furiously typing on their cell phones. Guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Robert Finch, the investor who had introduced Daniel to Richard, observed everything with an inscrutable expression. Helen felt Richard's arm grab her tightly, pulling her away from the stage. "Have you lost your mind?" he hissed, dragging her to an isolated corner of the yacht. "Do you know what you've just done?" "Exactly what I should have done. A long time ago," she replied, holding his gaze. "Chosen a side. And you chose against me. Against your husband." "I chose against the person you became, Richard. Or perhaps always were, and I was too blind to see." His face contorted in a mixture of anger and pain. "It was that photographer, wasn't it? He filled your head with these ideas, turned you against me. Daniel just showed me what I refused to see. The truth was there all along." Richard laughed, a bitter, cold sound. "The truth. What a grand word. Do you know what the truth is, Helen? That you were nothing before me, a little hotel receptionist with dreams bigger than your possibilities. I gave you everything, position, comfort, a respected name. And this is how you repay me?" Each word was a blade, but Helen was no longer letting herself be hurt. The Richard I knew in Cornwall would never speak like that. He loved me for who I was, not for what I could become. That Richard was a romantic idiot, he spat. Real life demands more than dreams and good intentions. Helen felt a wave of pity. The man in front of her was a stranger, consumed by his own ambition. "I'll sue you for defamation," Richard continued, now more controlled. "I'll destroy you and your photographer lover. When I'm done, you'll beg to come back to me." "I'm not afraid of you, Richard. Not anymore." He moved closer, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "You should be." At that moment, Daniel appeared beside them. "Any problem here?" Richard glared at him with contempt. "You're the problem. You invaded my home, seduced my wife, and now you're trying to destroy everything I've built." "Helen made her own decisions," Daniel replied, maintaining his calm. "And as for your empire, perhaps it was destined to crumble from the start. Nothing built on lies lasts forever." For an instant, Helen feared Richard would physically attack Daniel, but he merely smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "This isn't over," he said, adjusting his suit. "For neither of you." With that, he turned and returned to the center of the yacht, where he tried to control the damage with forced smiles and vague explanations. Daniel lightly touched Helen's arm. "Are you okay?" She nodded, exhausted but relieved. "Finally." In the days that followed, the scandal took on national proportions. Real estate heir accused of land grabbing by his own wife, the newspapers blared. The evidence gathered by Helen, Amanda, and Daniel was too solid to be ignored. Investigations were opened, licenses suspended, the Isle of Wight Paradise project frozen indefinitely. Richard, as he had promised, retaliated. He accused Helen of stealing confidential company documents, tried to publicly discredit her by insinuating mental problems, and filed for divorce alleging adultery. "He's desperate," Amanda explained during a secret meeting in a secluded cafe. "Company shares have plummeted, investors are pulling back, the board is pushing for his removal." Helen felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. It wasn't revenge she sought, just justice, and perhaps in some corner of her heart she still hoped the scandal would serve as a wake-up call for Richard, a chance for redemption. "How are you?" she asked her sister-in-law, concerned about the consequences Amanda would face for helping her. "Surviving," Amanda smiled, tired. "Dad is furious, obviously, but Mum, I think she secretly admires you for what you did." Helen was surprised. The matriarch of the Maxwell family had always seemed as submissive to her husband as Helen herself had been to Richard. "She called me yesterday," Amanda continued. "Said she always knew something was wrong with the business but chose not to see, like so many women in our position." The words hung between them, laden with a shared understanding of the price of silence, of passive complicity. Meanwhile, the apartment in Notting Hill had become a refuge for Helen. Away from the ostentatious luxury she was accustomed to, she discovered a liberating simplicity. She woke to the sound of birds, spent hours photographing the vibrant life of the neighborhood, discovering a talent she had suffocated for years. Daniel was a constant, but respectful presence. Despite the evident attraction between them, he maintained a deliberate distance, understanding that Helen needed to find herself before committing to a new relationship. "Any news from the village?" she asked one afternoon, as they developed photographs in the small darkroom they had improvised. Daniel nodded, hanging a negative to dry. "The pressure has completely eased. The families are breathing a sigh of relief. Mrs. Juniper sent you this." He handed Helen a small package. Inside, there was a handmade bracelet made of shells and colorful seeds. She said it's a protection charm, that you'll need it. Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. "What does that mean?" Daniel hesitated. "Richard is unstable. There are rumors that he won't accept losing everything without a fight. And to him, you are the main enemy." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. Helen knew Richard was not a man to accept defeat. His revenge would come sooner or later. Confirmation arrived in the form of a legal notice, not just the divorce, which she expected, but a formal accusation of corporate espionage, theft of intellectual property, defamation and conspiracy. Richard demanded not only all assets acquired during the marriage, which Helen would gladly concede, but millions in damages for harm to the company's image and financial losses resulting from criminal actions. "He wants to ruin me," Helen concluded, after the meeting with the lawyer Daniel had found through his contacts. "It's worse than that," the lawyer explained, a middle-aged man with tired eyes who had seen many legal battles. "These accusations could result in imprisonment. We're talking years, potentially." Daniel, sitting beside her, squeezed her hand in support. "But the evidence we gathered is about the company's illegal practices," the lawyer interrupted. "Which doesn't invalidate the fact that confidential documents were obtained without authorization. In the corporate world, that can be interpreted as industrial espionage." Helen felt the weight of reality crash down on her shoulders. She had underestimated Richard. While she sought justice, he played to destroy. "What are our options?" she asked, trying to keep calm. "We can try to reach a settlement. He would probably agree to withdraw the criminal charges in exchange for your silence and a public retraction." "Never," Helen replied immediately. "I won't deny the truth, not after everything." The lawyer sighed. "Then we have to fight, and it will be a difficult battle." In the following weeks, Helen's life became a roller coaster of depositions, preliminary hearings, and media attacks orchestrated by Richard's team. Her reputation, her sanity, her integrity, everything was publicly questioned. The nights were the worst. Alone in her room in the Notting Hill apartment, Helen faced doubts that gnawed at her from within. Had it been worth it? Would it have been better to remain silent, pretend she didn't know, continue being the trophy wife in exchange for security and comfort? On one of those sleepless nights, she heard soft knocks on the door. Daniel, equally sleepless, brought 2 cups of tea. "Thought you could use some company," he said, with that smile that warmed something inside her. They sat on the small balcony, watching the city lights below. London never fully slept, like Helen's thoughts. "Sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake," she confessed, breaking the silence. "If I shouldn't have just stayed quiet." Daniel studied her for a long moment. "Would you regret it more, fighting for the truth or living a lie?" The question hung between them like smoke. Helen knew the answer, but fear sometimes clouded her certainties. "I'm scared, Daniel. Richard has power, connections. If he really wants to destroy me—" "He also has enemies," Daniel interrupted. "People who were waiting for the perfect opportunity to bring him down. You're not alone in this fight." Their eyes met in the dim light. Helen felt that familiar electricity between them, stronger now, impossible to deny. Without words, they slowly moved closer. When their lips finally touched, it was as if something long sealed within Helen was finally released. The kiss intensified. Years of repressed desire, of loneliness, of searching for true connection exploding in a single moment. Daniel's hands on her waist, her body pressed against his, the forgotten tea cooling in the cups. Everything felt right, inevitable. It was Helen who pulled away first, breathless. "I can't," she whispered, her forehead still resting on his. "Not while I'm still legally married. I don't want to give Richard more ammunition." Daniel nodded, respecting her decision, even though frustration was evident in his eyes. "I'll wait as long as it takes. You're worth the wait." The intimate moment was brutally interrupted by the shrill ringing of Helen's cell phone. The number on the screen made her freeze. It was Amanda, who would never call at that hour unless it was an emergency. "Amanda, what happened?" Her sister-in-law's voice sounded tense, almost unrecognizable. "Helen, you need to know. Richard found out." "Found out what?" "About me. That I helped you. He found emails, conversations. I'm being escorted out of the company right now." Helen felt her blood run cold. "My God, Amanda, I'm so sorry." "That's not all," her sister-in-law interrupted. "He's coming after you now. He seemed different. I've never seen him like this before, so cold, so calculating. He said you're going to learn a lesson." Daniel, who was listening to the conversation on speakerphone, immediately became alert. "Do you know where he went?" "I'm not sure, but he mentioned Notting Hill." I think he knows where you are." Helen and Daniel exchanged alarmed glances. How had Richard discovered the address? "You need to get out of there now," Amanda urged. "I know my brother. He's not thinking rationally." They needed no further encouragement. In minutes, they gathered essential documents and a change of clothes. As they were about to leave, they heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching downstairs. Daniel ran to the window. It's him, with 2 guards. Helen felt panic grow. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building, with no elevator. The only exit was via the stairs, directly to where Richard was ascending. "Is there another exit?" Daniel asked, already looking for alternatives. Helen shook her head, desperate. Then she remembered. The balcony of 3B. It leads to the back fire escape. The neighboring apartment belonged to an elderly lady who spent seasons with her daughter in the countryside. Helen had never used that passage, but had often observed the balcony connected to the metal ladder that descended into an alley. "Can you jump?" Daniel asked, assessing the distance between the balconies. Helen nodded, though fear churned in her stomach. There was no time for hesitation. They could already hear heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. Daniel jumped first, easily covering the distance of just over a meter between the balconies. He extended his arms to Helen, who took a deep breath and leaped, safely caught on the other side. At the same instant, they heard the apartment door being violently broken down. "Helen!" Richard's voice, distorted by rage, echoed through the night. "I know. You're there." Without wasting time, they quickly descended the fire escape, the old metal creaking under their feet. As they reached the dark alley, Daniel held Helen's hand firmly, and they ran towards the parallel street, where more people meant more safety. "We need a safe place," Daniel panted as they ran. Helen thought quickly. "Mrs. Juniper, on the Isle of Wight. Richard would never think to look for us there." The irony did not escape either of them, seeking refuge in the very place that had started all the confusion. But it made sense. The small fishing village would be the last place Richard would search. They managed to hail a taxi on the busy street. The driver, noticing their agitated state, cast suspicious glances in the rearview mirror, but asked no questions when Daniel mentioned the bus station as their destination. On the way, Helen tried to process what had just happened. Richard invading her apartment with guards, the fury in his voice, the need to flee like criminals. Everything seemed like a surreal nightmare. "Do you think he'll follow us?" she whispered to Daniel. "Probably. That's why we can't go directly to the Isle of Wight. We need to throw him off." At the bus station, instead of buying tickets for the Isle of Wight, they purchased tickets for Bath, a planned detour. From there, they would take alternative transport to the coast. While waiting for the bus, Helen tried to call Amanda, but her sister-in-law's phone was off. Worry grew in her chest. What if Richard had done something to his own sister? "She'll be fine," Daniel reassured, as if reading her thoughts. "Amanda is strong, and Richard wouldn't risk an even bigger family scandal." Helen nodded, but the fear persisted. The reality of her situation began to weigh on her. In a matter of weeks, she had gone from being the wife of one of London's most powerful businessmen to a fugitive, pursued by the man who had once sworn to love and protect her. The bus to Bath departed at midnight. Sitting beside Daniel, watching the city lights recede, Helen finally allowed herself to release the tears she had held back. She cried silently for the lost marriage, for the sacrificed security, for the dreams that would never come true. Daniel put an arm around her, offering silent comfort. There were no words that could alleviate that moment, only presence, only the certainty of not being alone. When Helen finally fell asleep, exhausted by the emotional turmoil, she dreamed of the Isle of Wight sea, of Mrs. Juniper's calloused hands, of a simpler, truer life. And even in the midst of chaos, she felt a strange peace. Day was breaking when they arrived in Bath. The hilly city was slowly waking up, shopkeepers opening their stores, bakeries exuding the smell of fresh bread. A normality that seemed to belong to another world, distant from the pursuit they had left behind. Following the plan. They checked into a small guest house on the outskirts, using false names. Helen felt like a character in a spy movie, uncomfortable with every lie she had to tell. "We need to rest for a few hours," Daniel decided. Then we'll head to the Isle of Wight via secondary routes. In the small, simple room they lay side by side, too exhausted for any other thought beyond immediate rest. Helen fell asleep listening to Daniel's breathing, finding an inexplicable comfort in that sound. They were abruptly awakened by Daniel's cell phone ringing. On the display, an unknown number. "Hello," he answered cautiously. The voice on the other end made his face pale. After a few tense monosyllables, he hung up. "Who was that?" Helen asked, sitting up in bed, her heart racing. "Robert Finch," Daniel replied, his expression grave. "The investor, remember? He received a call from Richard looking for us." "How did he get your number?" "Robert says he didn't reveal anything, but—" Daniel hesitated. "But what?" "Richard mentioned the Isle of Wight. He said he knew we were heading there." Helen felt a chill. How could Richard know? Unless— "My cell phone," she whispered, understanding dawning, like a flash of lightning. "He must have tracked my cell phone." Daniel immediately took Helen's phone, removed the battery and SIM card, breaking them into pieces. "We need to change plans, now." The sun was already setting when they finally arrived in Dartmouth, a historic town halfway to the Isle of Wight. They had opted for an even longer route, taking local buses, alternating with hitchhiking, always alert for any sign of pursuit. In a small seaside guest house, they registered as a honeymoon couple. The room was simple but cozy, with a view of the sea that stretched to the horizon, painted in orange hues by the sunset. Helen sat on the small balcony, watching fishermen return with their nets after a day's work. There was a raw, honest beauty in that scene, so different from the artificial world she had lived in for years. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, sitting beside her and offering a cup of coffee. "How life can completely change in such a short time," she replied, accepting the hot drink. "A month ago, I was Mrs. Maxwell, living in a penthouse in Brighton, attending gala events. Now I'm here fleeing the man who was my husband, not knowing what tomorrow holds." Daniel studied her profile for a moment. "Do you regret it?" Helen turned to face him. "No," she replied firmly. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm living honestly. Scared, yes. Uncertain, of course. But alive." The look they exchanged conveyed more than words could express. A mutual understanding, a recognition of kindred souls who had found each other in the midst of chaos. Slowly, as if afraid to break the moment, they drew closer. This time, when their lips met, there was no hesitation. The kiss deepened. Years of repressed desires, of denied connections, exploding in a moment of complete abandon. Daniel's hands traced her back, her neck, intertwining in her hair. Helen responded with equal intensity, feeling every cell of her body awaken to sensations she had forgotten were possible. When they finally pulled away, breathless, a silent decision had been made. Tonight, there would be no more barriers between them. "Are you sure?" Daniel whispered, his eyes searching for any sign of doubt in hers. Helen nodded, pulling him closer. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life." That night, in a simple seaside room, away from the world's gaze, Helen rediscovered parts of herself she had buried for years. In every touch, every sigh, every moment of abandon, she felt herself reborn. Afterward, nestled in Daniel's arms, listening to the sound of waves breaking on the beach, she allowed herself to dream of a different future, a future built not on appearances and social conventions, but on truth and genuine connection. "What will we do now?" she whispered against Daniel's chest. He gently stroked her hair. "We keep fighting. For the truth, for justice for those families, for our freedom. And if Richard never gives up, then we won't give up either." Helen closed her eyes, absorbing the implicit promise in those words. It wouldn't be easy. The road ahead was uncertain, perhaps dangerous. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone on the journey. The next morning they resumed their journey to the Isle of Wight. This time not as desperate fugitives, but as determined warriors. The battle against Richard had only just begun, and they were ready for the next chapter. The Isle of Wight revealed itself to them in an explosion of green and blue, the ancient woodlands-covered hills descending to kiss the crystal-clear sea. Helen felt a strange sense of return as she contemplated the landscape. as if, in some way, this place had always been destined to be a crucial part of her story. The small fishing village was secluded from the tourist center, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through dense vegetation. When they finally arrived late in the afternoon, they were met by the suspicious gazes of the residents. Strangers rarely brought good news to a community so often threatened. It was Mrs. Juniper who first recognized them, her wrinkled face breaking into a warm smile that erased years from her expression. "You came," she said, embracing Helen with the surprising strength of her thin arms. "I knew you would return." News of their arrival spread quickly. Soon they were surrounded by fishermen, women, and children, all wanting to thank them for what they had done. To these simple people, Helen and Daniel were heroes, the outsiders who had risked everything to defend their homes, their way of life, their dignity. "We're not heroes," Helen tried to explain, embarrassed by the reception. "We just did what was right." "Sometimes doing what's right when everyone else is doing wrong is heroism enough," replied Mr. James, the oldest fisherman in the village, whose clear eyes contrasted with skin tanned by decades under the sun. Helen and Daniel were settled in Mrs. Juniper's house, a simple but cozy space with colorful walls and a veranda from which one could contemplate the endless sea. For the first time in days, Helen felt truly safe. "You can stay as long as you need," the old woman affirmed, serving strong coffee accompanied by freshly baked local specialty cake. "No one will find you here." That night, under a sky more star-studded than Helen had ever seen before, far from the city's light pollution, they sat on the beach with some residents around an improvised bonfire. Amidst stories and laughter, the tension of the past few days began to dissipate. "How's the situation out there?" Daniel asked Mr. James, keeping his voice low so as not to alarm the others. The old fisherman sighed deeply. "The newspapers talk a lot about the scandal. They say your husband's company—" He looked at Helen awkwardly. "Ex-husband's is in serious trouble. Investigations. Shareholders fleeing like rats from a sinking ship." Helen felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She didn't wish for Richard's destruction. She just wanted him to face the consequences of his actions, for the affected people to receive justice. "And about us?" she asked, fearing the answer. "There are posters with your photos in the city," the fisherman replied, his face grim. "A reward for anyone who provides information. The man is determined to find you." Daniel instinctively moved closer to Helen, as if he could protect her with just his presence. "We need to think about our next step. We can't stay hidden forever." That night, Helen took a long time to fall asleep. Beside Daniel, listening to his rhythmic breathing, she thought about how her life had transformed into something unrecognizable in such a short time. From trophy wife to fugitive, from prisoner in a gilded cage to a free but hunted woman. And yet, she had never felt so alive, so true, so much in control of her own destiny. Morning brought not only the sun, but an unexpected visit. Amanda, pale and visibly exhausted, arrived in the village accompanied by Mr. James, who had found her at the entrance asking for them. "How did you find us?" Helen asked, embracing her sister-in-law tightly after the initial shock. "It wasn't difficult," Amanda replied with a half-smile. "Knowing you, I knew you'd come to where it all began. Besides, I needed to warn you personally." The expression on Amanda's face sent a shiver down Helen's spine. "What happened?" Sitting in Mrs. Juniper's small kitchen, Amanda recounted the events of the past few days. Richard, more determined than ever, had hired private investigators to track them. But that wasn't all. There was evidence he was planning something more sinister. "I found this in his office," Amanda said, handing Daniel a USB drive. "Their conversations with a man named Augustus Vance, ex-policeman now. Well, let's just say he solves problems for people like my brother. Permanently." Daniel connected the device to his laptop. The files confirmed the worst. Richard had hired a professional assassin disguised as a security consultant to resolve the Evans and Maxwell situation. "He's completely lost his mind," Helen whispered, her face pale at the evidence of Richard's obsession. "I never thought he'd go this far. You threatened the only thing he truly loves. The empire he built," Amanda explained, her voice bitter. "To Richard, you've transformed from trophy to enemy. And he won't rest until he eliminates you." Daniel abruptly closed the laptop. We need to take this to the police immediately. Amanda shook her head. I've already thought about that. The problem is that Richard has the London police in the palm of his hand. We need someone above any of his influence. Perhaps I can help, Mrs. Juniper offered, who had been listening to the conversation in silence. My nephew works for the National Crime Agency in London. An honest, incorruptible man. If we can send these proofs to him... A plan began to form. They would use Mrs. Juniper's nephew's help to take the case directly to the National Crime Agency, bypassing local authorities Richard might control. Meanwhile, Daniel would use his press contacts to ensure the story received national attention, making any cover-up impossible. There's just one problem, Amanda observed. You need to get out of here. This is the first place Richard will look when he finds out I'm missing. Helen felt the weight of reality crash down on her shoulders. Once again, they would have to flee. Once again, danger lurked. Where do we go? She asked Daniel, feeling the exhaustion of the whole situation finally catch up to her. He held her hand firmly. I have an idea, but it's risky. Daniel's plan was audacious. Instead of continuing to flee, they would confront Richard directly. Not physically, but using his own weapons against him. The media, public opinion, exposure. He wants us in the shadows, hidden, cornered, Daniel explained. What if we do the exact opposite? What if we become so public that he can't touch us without the whole world knowing? The strategy was risky, but it made sense. With the help of Robert Finch, who, after learning of Richard's murderous intentions, decided to support them, they would organize a press conference in London, away from Richard's direct influence, but large enough to ensure national coverage. I'll expose everything, Helen decided. Not just the company's illegal practices, but the threats, the persecution, the attempt to silence. All of England will know who Richard Maxwell truly is. Over the next 2 days, they worked tirelessly on preparations. Amanda served as an intermediary, ensuring the security of the press conference venue and the presence of the country's most important media outlets. Daniel organized all the evidence, creating a clear and irrefutable narrative about Richard's corporate crimes and his campaign of terror against his ex-wife. Helen, in turn, prepared for the most difficult moment of her life, to expose herself completely, to reveal not only Richard's criminal actions, but her own journey, from submissive wife to a woman who found the courage to face a corrupt system, even at the risk of losing everything. On the eve of the press conference, as they made final adjustments to the material, they received an alarming call from Mrs. Juniper's nephew. Augustus Vance, the assassin hired by Richard, had been located in London. The trap was set. He knows, Daniel concluded, his face pale. Somehow Richard discovered our plan. Helen felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the fear that had already become her constant companion in recent weeks. But this time, something different emerged with it, a fierce, almost primitive determination. I won't back down, she declared, surprising everyone with the firmness in her voice. If he wants war, he'll get war. Tomorrow I will face Richard Maxwell head-on, without masks, without hiding places, and may the side of truth win. That night, in the London hotel room where they stayed under false names, Helen and Daniel experienced hours of almost painful intensity. They made love as if it were the last time, with urgency, passion, and a total surrender that transcended the physical. Afterward, nestled in his arms, Helen allowed herself to cry for the last time, not from fear or sadness, but from a strange mixture of gratitude and resolution. If something happens to me tomorrow, she whispered against Daniel's chest. He silenced her with a kiss. Nothing will happen. I'll be by your side every second. Even so, she insisted, I want you to know that you saved me. Not just from physical danger, but from a life of lies. You showed me that there's always a choice, always a path to truth. Daniel gently stroked her hair. You saved yourself, Helen. I was just there to witness your courage. The morning arrived cold and grey, as if the sky itself reflected the gravity of the day that was beginning. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the auditorium of one of London's largest newspapers. Dozens of reporters, photographers and cameramen were already waiting when Helen, Daniel and Amanda arrived through the back. escorted by disguised federal agents. "They're all here," Robert Finch, who met them in the backstage room, informed them. "Newspapers, magazines, television, even international correspondence." Helen nodded, adjusting the simple but elegant suit she had chosen for the occasion. No flashy dresses or jewelry. Today was about substance, not appearance. "Any sign of him?" Daniel asked, referring to Vance, the assassin hired by Richard. "Nothing yet," one of the federal agents replied. "But the team is on high alert. If he tries anything, he'll be apprehended immediately." The minutes leading up to Helen's entrance on stage were the longest of her life. Each beat of her heart seemed to echo in her ears as she mentally rehearsed the words she would use to expose the truth. "It's time," Robert announced, opening the door that led to the stage. Helen took a deep breath. Daniel squeezed her hand one last time, his eyes conveying all the strength and confidence she needed in that moment. "I'll be right behind you," he promised. The flash of cameras momentarily blinded her as she stepped onto the stage. A wave of voices, questions, exclamations. Helen felt her stomach churn, but she stood firm. She walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and faced the crowd of curious faces. It was then that she saw him. In the last row, almost hidden among the journalists, Richard. His face a mask of coldness, his eyes fixed on her with a disturbing intensity. For a brief moment, Helen felt panic threaten to overwhelm her. Then she remembered all the lies, all the manipulation, all the fear she had lived through. She remembered the families on the Isle of Wight, Mrs. Juniper, her own rebirth away from the golden chains that imprisoned her. "My name is Helen Maxwell," she began, her voice firmer than she had ever imagined possible, "and today I am here to tell the story of two worlds that collided, a world of power, ambition, and corruption, and a world of simple people fighting for the right to exist." As she spoke, she noticed the audience's reaction: shock, indignation, compassion. She presented documents, photos, recordings. She recounted every corporate crime she had discovered, every threat she had suffered, every sacrifice she had made in the name of truth. "I am not here merely as a whistleblower," she concluded, after almost an hour of exposition. "I am here as a woman who finally found her voice, as a human being who chose truth over security, justice over comfort." When she finished, a stunned silence fell over the auditorium. Then, like a wave breaking on the shore, came the reaction. Applause, urgent questions, cameras firing frantically. Helen searched for Richard with her eyes, but he had disappeared. A shiver ran down her spine. Where could he be? What was he planning? The answer came faster than she expected. As she answered journalists' questions, the side door of the auditorium burst open violently. Richard stormed down the aisle like a force of nature, followed by two guards. "Lies!" he shouted, approaching the stage. "All lies from a disturbed woman." The disguised federal agents immediately moved, blocking his advance. The crowd of journalists erupted in even more questions, cameras turning to the new dramatic scene unfolding. "You destroyed my life," Richard continued, his eyes bloodshot and fixed on Helen. "You betrayed my trust, my name, everything we built." Helen remained impressively calm amidst the storm. "No, Richard. You destroyed your own life when you chose profit over ethics, power over humanity. And as for betrayal," she paused significantly, "it was you who first betrayed what we had when you stopped seeing me as a person and started treating me as property." The heated exchange continued for a few minutes, captured by dozens of cameras broadcast live across the country. Richard, increasingly out of control, ended up revealing more than he intended in his fury, inadvertently confirming many of the accusations Helen had made. It was when one of Richard's guards made a sudden move towards his jacket that chaos truly erupted. Federal agents immediately intervened, subduing him and discovering a weapon. It wasn't Vance, as they feared, but one of Richard's trusted men, instructed to resolve the situation if things got out of hand. In a matter of seconds, the auditorium transformed into a movie scene, Richard and his guards being immobilized and handcuffed, journalists in a frenzy trying to capture every detail, federal agents revealing their identities, and taking control of the situation. Daniel ran to the stage, protectively enveloping Helen as she watched, stunned, Richard being led away. Their eyes met one last time. His full of hatred and disbelief, hers with a mixture of pity and relief. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind. The case became one of the country's biggest corporate scandals. Richard was indicted for various crimes, from environmental fraud to attempted murder. Maxwell Developments entered receivership, with a new board taking control and promising to compensate the affected communities. Helen testified several times in both criminal and civil proceedings. Each testimony was painful but also liberating, like cleaning a wound so it could finally heal. The divorce was finalized on surprisingly favorable terms for Helen. Not out of Richard's generosity, certainly, but because his bargaining power had been drastically reduced by the circumstances. 3 months after the fateful press conference, Helen returned to the Isle of Wight, no longer a fugitive, but an honored visitor. The small fishing village organized a celebration to welcome her. Music, food, dancing, pure and simple joy. "You saved our homes, our history," Mrs. Juniper declared, moved. "You will always have a place here." It was during that visit that Helen made her final decision. She would use part of the money received in the divorce settlement to create a foundation, dedicated to protecting traditional communities threatened by large developments, offering legal assistance, documenting their histories, preserving their cultural heritage. "I'll need an excellent photographer to document these communities," she commented to Daniel, as they watched the sunset on the village beach, hands intertwined, bodies close. He smiled, that smile that had illuminated the darkest moments of her journey. "I know one who would take the job, especially if he could work alongside the foundation's director." Helen leaned in to kiss him, feeling that familiar electricity that never diminished. When they pulled away, she contemplated the man who had entered, her life like a storm, and ended up becoming her safe harbor. "Do you think one day we'll get over all this?" she asked, referring not only to the trauma of the persecution, but to the entire transformation they had lived through. Daniel reflected for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun dipped into the sea. "It's not about getting over it, but about integrating it. Everything we've lived brought us here, transformed us into the people we are now. And those people," he turned to face her, "those people found something rare, something true." Helen felt tears in her eyes, but not from sadness or fear, from a profound happiness, the kind found only after weathering the storm. "Something true," she repeated, savoring the words, "and that no one can take from us." As night fell over the Isle of Wight, enveloping the village in its starry cloak, Helen and Daniel walked back to Mrs. Juniper's house, where they would stay for a few weeks while planning the foundation's next steps. Steps they would take together, as partners, lovers, accomplices in a new journey. The path would not be easy. There would still be legal battles, the ghost of Richard who would eventually be released, the challenges of building something new from the ashes of the old. But for the first time in her life, Helen did not fear the future. On the contrary, she longed for it with the confidence of someone who had finally found her place in the world, not as the shadow of someone powerful, but as the protagonist of her own story. A story that, ironically, truly began when she dared to say no, when she chose to abandon the security of a lie for the risk of truth. A story of redemption, courage, and above all, love. Not the idealized love of fairy tales, but real, imperfect love, tested by fire and strengthened by adversity. The love that is born when two people see each other completely, without masks, without pretenses, and decide to walk together even knowing that the road will be difficult. The love that, in the end, is the only revolution that truly matters.